back in the 40s and 50s, the original standard television had a 4:3 width to height ratio. That shape was chosen to be a slight rectangle, but still mostly square, thus having the maximal screen area for the given dimensions. And that's still the ratio on many TVs and computer monitors in today's homes. The problem is, hardly anybody today creates video content in a 4:3 ratio. See, this whole problem started when people wanted to watch movies from the theater in the comfort of their own homes. Movie screens are considerably larger than our home television. More important, the screen is a completely different rectangle and can't mathematically fit on our TV screens without manipulation. A typical TV is 1 1/3 times wider than it is tall. Some movie screens could be up to 3 times as wide as it is tall. So what are we going to do to make it fit? Well, we have all kinds of options. Well, we could squeeze and stretch and mangle everything onto the screen to make it all fill up, and everyone would look ridiculously thin and compressed. The good news is, the sound would be just fine. Although I don't think people would be too happy about that option, particularly the actors in the movie. We could just cut a chunk of the original movie like a cookie cutter and just see that frame of the movie. Problem with that would people and objects be speaking from off the screen, or even worse, they might be cut in half. Some movie editors use what's called the pan and scan technique to allow the full height of the TV screen to be used, but pick and choose what section of the original movie should be shown on your screen, thus eliminating the annoying cutting of people.
How, as a journalist, do you ask the questions that yield this type of narrative? You have to know what to ask of whom. First, you need to understand that every piece of journalism requires a trifecta of sourcing. If you picture the reporting process as depicted by a triangle, one side will be official sources, another side will be overview sources, and a third side will be unofficial sources. All three components are necessary in every well-reported piece. The first side has official sources. Those are the people with titles and expertise who own the company, are spokespeople for the movement. They tell you the numbers and the answers to how much, how many, where, when, and who. A second side of the triangle includes overview sources. Academics, consultants, authors, who are not directly connected as stakeholders, but have knowledge of the big picture. Yet it is the third side of the trifecta, unofficial sources, who hold the power of the individual's insight. This is where you can find the why, giving consequence on the event, trend, phase, or idea, and what it means on a soul level to someone affected by it. So how do you mine for the gems, identifying what is compelling from what is chatter? You ask surprising questions. To achieve the complicated, fragile human connection, you regard the stories of every subject as sacred. Realize that an anecdote is oxygen that breathes life into a gray story of exposition, facts, and data.
And systemic errors don't just appear in matters of human judgment. From 1993 to 2008, the same female DNA was found in multiple crime scenes around Europe, incriminating an elusive killer dubbed the Phantom of Heilbronn. But the DNA evidence was so consistent precisely because it was wrong. It turned out that the cotton swabs used to collect the DNA samples had all been accidentally contaminated by a woman working in the swab factory. In other cases, systematic errors arise through deliberate fraud, like the presidential referendum held by Saddam Hussein in 2002, which claimed a turnout of 100% of voters, with all 100% supposedly voting in favor of another 7-year term. When you look at it this way, the paradox of unanimity isn't actually all that paradoxical. Unanimous agreement is still theoretically ideal, especially in cases when you'd expect very low odds of variability and uncertainty. But in practice, achieving it in situations where perfect agreement is highly unlikely should tell us that there's probably some hidden factor affecting the system. Although we may strive for harmony and consensus, in many situations, error and disagreement should be naturally expected. And if a perfect result seems too good to be true, it probably is. And though it may sound surprising, the best way to stay protected before, during, and after a nuclear detonation is getting inside. Similar to protecting yourself from tornadoes or hurricanes, getting and staying inside a sturdy building would offer protection from the explosion's shockwave, heat, and radiation. The shockwave of energy would travel several kilometers beyond the fireball's radius in the first few seconds. Sturdy buildings within that range should be able to withstand the shockwave, and staying in the centers and basements of these buildings also helps provide protection from heat and flying objects. Finding shelter is especially important if the fireball occurs close to the Earth, as it will pull thousands of tons of dirt and debris several kilometers into the atmosphere. As the fireball cools, unstable atoms created by the nuclear fission mix with the debris to produce the most dangerous long-term effect of a nuclear detonation, radioactive particles called fallout. These sand-sized particles emit ionizing radiation, capable of separating electrons from molecules and atoms. Exposure to massive amounts of this radiation can result in cell damage, radiation burns, radiation sickness, cancer, and even death. Thankfully, the same buildings that offer protection from the blast are even better at guarding against fallout. Radiation is reduced as it travels through space and mass. So while a broken window and sealed window both have the same minimal effect on radiation, thick layers of steel, concrete, and packed earth can offer serious protection.
Today, the US power grid is the world's largest machine. It contains more than 7,300 electricity-generating plants, linked by some 11 million kilometers of power lines, transformers, and substations. Power grids span Earth's continents, transmitting electricity around the clock. They're massive feats of engineering, but their functioning depends on a delicate balance. Their components must always work in unison, maintain a constant frequency throughout the grid, and match energy supply with demand. If there's too much electricity in the system, you get unsafe power spikes that can overheat and damage equipment. Too little electricity, and you get blackouts. So, to strike this balance, power grid operators monitor the grid from sophisticated control centers. They forecast energy demand and adjust which power plants are active, signaling them to turn their output up or down to precisely meet current demand. By considering factors like the availability and cost of energy resources, grid operators create a dispatch curve, which maps out the order in which energy sources will be used. The grid defaults to using energy from the start of the curve first. Usually the resources are ordered by price. Those at the start tend to be renewables because they have much lower production costs.
People make friends with other people when they spend casual time together. This is how our ancestors formed their relationships, because humans lived in small, close-knit communities in which options for making friends were limited, so we just formed good relationships with the people who were around us. This is why it's so easy to form new friendships in school and university. Society locks you and your peers in a building for several years. You share similar activities, but more importantly, similar schedules. Overlapping and fluctuating social circles form, naturally giving you regular FaceTime and shared experiences with many different people. Time to find others with similar worldviews or senses of humor. Proximity can be more important than similar interests. One study found that in student dormitories, the distance between rooms was the strongest friendship predictor. Living closer together meant a higher chance of becoming friends. Another study showed that being physically present in a class a lot without saying a word makes others more sympathetic to you. So the most important principle of making friends is to regularly spend time with people in the real world. This alone can make it happen automatically and trumps all other advice.
Well, today I'm going to tell you about a serious reality that is changing our oceans, called ocean acidification, or the evil twin of climate change. Did you know that the oceans have absorbed 25% of all of the carbon dioxide that we have emitted to the atmosphere? Now, this is just another great service provided by the oceans, since carbon dioxide is one of the greenhouse gases that's causing climate change. But as we keep pumping more and more and more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, more is dissolving into the oceans. And this is what's changing our ocean chemistry. When carbon dioxide dissolves in seawater, it undergoes a number of chemical reactions. Now, lucky for you, I don't have time to get into the details of the chemistry for today, but I'll tell you, as more carbon dioxide enters the ocean, the seawater pH goes down. And this basically means that there is an increase in ocean acidity. And this whole process is called ocean acidification, and it's happening alongside climate change. Scientists have been monitoring ocean acidification for over 2 decades. This figure is an important time series in Hawaii, and the top line shows a steadily increasing concentrations of carbon dioxide, or CO2 gas, in the atmosphere. And this is directly as a result of human activities. The line underneath shows the increasing concentrations of carbon dioxide that is dissolved in the surface of the ocean, which you can see is increasing at the same rate as carbon dioxide in the atmosphere since measurements began. The line on the bottom then shows the change in chemistry. As more carbon dioxide has entered the ocean, the seawater pH has gone down, which basically means there has been an increase in ocean acidity.
There are 2 major factors that cause food to go bad: microbes and oxidation. Microbes like bacteria and fungi invade food and feed off its nutrients. Some of these can cause diseases like listeria and botulism. Others just turn edibles into a smelly, slimy, moldy mess. Meanwhile, oxidation is a chemical change in the food's molecules caused by enzymes or free radicals, which turn fats rancid and brown produce like apples and potatoes. Preservatives can prevent both types of deterioration. Before the invention of artificial refrigeration, fungi and bacteria could run rampant in food. So we found ways to create an inhospitable environment for microbes. For example, making the food more acidic unravels enzymes that microbes need to survive. And some types of bacteria can actually help. For thousands of years, people preserved food using bacteria that produce lactic acid. The acid turns perishable vegetables and milk into longer-lasting foods like sauerkraut in Europe, kimchi in Korea, and yogurt in the Middle East. These cultured foods also populate your digestive tract with beneficial microbes. Many synthetic preservatives are also acids. benzoic acid in salad dressing, sorbic acid in cheese, and propionic acid in baked goods.
Most people intuitively blame it on their nerves. But why does being nervous undermine expert performance? There are two sets of theories, which both say that primarily choking under pressure boils down to focus. First, there are the distraction theories. These suggest that performance suffers when the mind is preoccupied with worries, doubts, or fears, instead of focusing its attention on performing the task at hand. When relevant and irrelevant thoughts compete for the same attention, something has to give. The brain can only process so much information at once. Tasks that challenge working memory, the mental scratch pad we use to temporarily store phone numbers and grocery lists, are especially vulnerable to pressure. In a 2004 study, a group of university students were asked to perform math problems, some easy, others more complex and memory-intensive. Half the students completed both problem types with nothing at stake, while the others completed them when calm and under pressure. While everyone did well on the easy problems, those who were stressed performed worse on the more difficult memory-intensive tasks. Explicit monitoring theories make up the second group of explanations for choking under pressure. They're concerned with how pressure can cause people to overanalyze the task at hand. Here, the logic goes that once a skill becomes automatic, thinking about its precise mechanics interferes with your ability to do it. Tasks we do unconsciously seem to be most vulnerable to this kind of choking.
So my optimism is rooted in the fact that for over almost 200 years, every year has gotten a little bit better when we look at the scientific evidence. And that while it's possible that next year everything could change, everything could collapse and fall to the ground, statistically, probabilistically, it won't. It will continue because 200 years is gone, and next year it probably will continue. But if you look at the kind of current political regime around the world and the factors of pressures, environmental pressures, the pressures of distraction that we have from the new media, then I think you have to resort to hope. In the long term, optimists decide the future. It's the optimists who create all the things that are going to be most important in our lives, because it was the optimists who built and invented all the things that are now important in our current lives. And I think people behave better when they're optimistic. There's absolutely a need to be critical and doubtful and skeptical and even pessimistic. Just like if you have a car, you have to have brakes. You can't have a car, no matter where it is, without brakes. But it's the engine, the optimistic engine that keeps going and refuses to stop and is only concerned about going forward, that really drives a car.
You could put a Trader Joe's or Walmart on every corner, and the food insecure could still not afford to eat or to buy what they should be eating. Why? Because America's food system is designed from the Farm Bill on up to make calories cheap and nutrition expensive. And that's why the face of hunger in America today is an obese person. Food insecure Americans are forced to fill up on food that's loaded with sugar, fat, sodium, little nutrition. Hence, the answer isn't a full stomach. It's a healthy meal. So my next learning was about money. Nonprofits tend to spend 75% of management's time in fundraising. They do great work. It's the air they breathe. But funder fatigue sets in. Funding dries up. So I wondered, instead of seeking donors to continually fund our mission year after year, would it be possible to have a mission that could fund itself? Well, we did something interesting. We actually went into a food insecure neighborhood and asked the people what they wanted. And they said, we don't want handouts. We want to buy tasty, nutritious food we can afford. We're not looking for charity. We're buying food now. We want to keep buying food. Don't make your store needs-based. Everybody should be able to shop there. We don't want to feel stigmatized by shopping in a store that's just for poor people. another light bulb. It turns out people are even hungrier to keep their dignity than for nutrition, which means we can use the dignity problem to help solve the funding problem.
First, gases always move in a straight line. We don't really have anything to demonstrate this with because gravity always pulls objects down. So, imagine a bullet fired from a gun, and that bullet goes on at a constant speed in a perfectly straight line. That would be like a gas molecule. Second, gases are so small, they occupy no volume on their own. As a group they do. Blow up any balloon and you can see how that volume changes. But single gases have no volume compared to other forms of matter. Rather than calculating such a small amount of matter, we just call it zero for simplicity. Third, if gas molecules collide, and they do, remember these are assumptions, their energy remains constant. An easy way to demonstrate this is by dropping a soccer ball with a tennis ball balanced on top. Because the soccer ball is bigger, it has more potential energy, and the energy from the larger ball is transferred to the smaller tennis ball and it flies away when that energy is transferred. The total energy stays the same. Gases work the same way. If they collide, smaller particles will speed up, larger particles will slow down. The total energy is constant. Fourth, gases do not attract one another, and they don't like to touch. But remember rule 3, in reality they do collide. Finally, gases have energy that is proportional to the temperature. The higher the temperature, the higher the energy the gases have. The crazy thing is that at the same temperature, all gases have the same energy. It doesn't depend on the type of gas, just the temperature that gas is at.
Of course, living on the moon won't be easy. The camp envisioned is not so much a village as an inhabited research base, similar to those in places like Antarctica. But there are far greater obstacles to living on the moon than just cold weather. The biggest is cosmic radiation. Unlike the Earth, the moon has no atmosphere and no magnetic field. A person on its surface can receive over 400 times the maximum safe dosage of heavy ion radiation, enough to be fatal within 10 hours, even in a spacesuit. The first step would likely involve robots and 3D printers constructing covered habitats from lunar soil, or building shelters inside caves formed by lava tubes from the moon's volcanic past. But what would the inhabitants live on? Supplies would need to be transported from Earth at first. Growing plants requires greenhouse soil and air rich in carbon dioxide, a gas that's rare on the moon, but could be synthesized from recycled materials. A water treatment plant could be supplied by ice mined from the polar regions, using a specialized drill that can bore 2 meters beneath the lunar surface. Friendly bacteria and viruses necessary to the human microbiome and immune system would also have to be imported or synthesized on site. And lunar inhabitants would have to exercise for hours a day to maintain bone and muscle mass. That's because the moon's gravity is just 1/6 that of the Earth, and the everyday strain of working against gravity is part of what keeps our bodies healthy. There's evidence that caffeine's effects on adenosine and dopamine receptors can have long-term benefits too, reducing the risk of diseases like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and some types of cancer. Caffeine can also ramp up the body's ability to burn fat. In fact, some sports organizations think that caffeine gives athletes an unfair advantage and have placed limits on its consumption. From 1972 until 2004, Olympic athletes had to stay below a certain blood caffeine concentration to compete. Of course, not all of caffeine's effects are so helpful. It might make you feel better and more alert, but it can also raise your heart rate and blood pressure, cause increased urination or diarrhea, and contribute to insomnia and anxiety. Plus, the foods and beverages caffeine is found in have their own impacts on your body that have to be taken into account. Your brain can adapt to regular consumption of caffeine. If your adenosine receptors are perpetually clogged, your body will manufacture extra ones. That way, even with caffeine around, adenosine can still do its job of signaling the brain to power down. That's why you may find you need to consume more and more caffeine to feel as alert. There are more and more adenosine receptors to block.
Over the past few months, the government has been pushing to remove all advertising outlets for the tobacco industry, and in particular pushing for plain packaging. The tobacco industry, however, is against this, and they in particular argue that the cigarette box is not a form of advertising. Michaela has been doing her PhD looking at cigarette advertising and how it's changed over the last 50 years. Basically, I've accessed advertising from the tobacco industry since 1950s and just analyzed the images and looked at the use of the cigarette box within the adverts. In the very early adverts, the cigarette box is a tiny part of the adverts and they focus much more on the social aspects of smoking. However, as you move through the decades and get closer to the present day, the cigarette box became more and more of a focal point in the adverts. My argument is that the cigarette box has become iconic for each brand. So when a smoker takes a box out of their pocket, they are advertising that brand. So what we hope will come out of this is that the government will introduce plain packaging. And like Australia, which has already introduced its policy, and Ireland, who are again beginning to introduce its policy, we hope that the UK will stop cigarette companies from using their boxes as a form of advertising.
The modern fantasy about, wow, business is changing so quickly, you've got to keep morphing and changing, updating your brand, getting a new visual identity, all of those things, they're just bad. Bad, 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 bad. Don't do them. Why? It's because you interrupt habit. So rather than a consumer thinking about, oh, wow, I am loyal to, let's say, Tide. I'm loyal to Tide detergent. I really should buy it. It's actually that person's subconscious saying, you know, the most comfortable thing to do, the thing we in your subconscious are most confident of is that thing that worked for us before. So please, please, please don't think about buying something else. Tide's been around for 76 years, and it has what we call cumulative advantage. Cumulative advantage is what you increasingly build as the customer becomes more and more comfortable with using your product or service. Each time they use it and get the benefits they wish, you get more cumulative advantage that causes the subconscious to say, I'm totally comfortable with this, and I would be uncomfortable if we did something else. That's the win of cumulative advantage.
As Emerson once put it, in the minds of geniuses we find once more our own neglected thoughts. It's almost certain that people who have devoted themselves to self-honesty and self-observation have an above-average chance of meeting with incomprehension, irritation, censorship, or boredom when they attempt to share the data from their own minds frankly in company. Their thoughts, it might be on politics or architecture, family life or sexuality, will sound more threatening, more intense, oblique or tender than is allowed. That feels lonely if one's in the mood to frame things like this. There are simply fewer people at large committed to self-honesty and self-observation, and therefore up for exchanging notes on what it's truly like to be alive. Yet there is one resource that is exceptionally well suited to addressing the feelings of disconnection liable to be felt by the emotionally intelligent: art. Works of art are humanity's secret diary, records of all that could not be said in regular social contexts, but which have found a home in the more intimate, honest communication that can take place between an artwork and its audience.
And there are many benefits of moral outrage, but there are also many costs. So the benefits can fall into two broad categories. The first category of benefit is social benefits. So when we express outrage about some kind of wrongdoing, that teaches others that that kind of behavior is not going to be tolerated, and it can motivate other people to behave morally so that they can avoid getting shamed or punished for breaking the rules. The other kind of benefit that moral outrage brings about is personal. Moral outrage broadcasts to the rest of your social group that you are the kind of person who's not likely to break the rules. So these two benefits of expressing outrage have to be balanced against the costs of outrage.
Walking is the most fundamental basic form of human physical activity. The average sort of hunter-gatherer will take 10,000 to 15,000 steps a day. The average American before the pandemic was taking something like 4,700 or so steps a day. Only about 20% of Americans get the very minimum levels of exercise that every health organization in the world thinks is the minimum for an adult, which is 150 minutes a week. So 80% of us really struggle and fail to get very basic amounts of exercise. But almost everyone says that they want to get enough exercise. We live in a world where we no longer have to be physically active. We now, in a very strange way, have to choose to be physically active. And that's not so easy 'cause there were no ellipticals and other kinds of machines back in the Stone Age. If you want to get your heart rate up, you were probably running. And one of the biggest myths about running is that it'll destroy your knees. There are tons and tons of studies, more than a dozen randomized, controlled prospective, gold standard studies, which show that people who run more are less likely to get arthritis. In fact, lots of research shows that physical activities like running cause your joints to repair themselves and to stay healthy. The other kinds of running injuries, I think that a lot of them are caused because we don't learn how to run properly anymore. I think running is a skill like swimming or throwing or, all kinds of other things that we do.
Why are there so many jobs? There are actually two fundamental economic principles at stake. One has to do with human genius and creativity. The other has to do with human insatiability, or greed, if you like. I'm going to call the first of these the O-ring principle, and it determines the type of work that we do. The second principle is the never get enough principle, and it determines how many jobs there actually are. Let's start with the O-ring. ATMs, automated teller machines, had two countervailing effects on bank teller employment. As you'd expect, they replaced a lot of teller tasks. The number of tellers per branch fell by about a third. But banks quickly discovered it also was cheaper to open new branches, and the number of bank branches increased by about 40% in the same time period. The net result was more branches and more tellers. But those tellers were doing somewhat different work. As their routine cash handling tasks receded, they became less like checkout clerks and more like salespeople, forging relationships with customers, solving problems, and introducing them to new products like credit cards, loans, and investments. More tellers doing a more cognitively demanding job. There's a general principle here. Most of the work that we do requires a multiplicity of skills. And brains and brawn, technical expertise and intuitive mastery, perspiration and inspiration, in the words of Thomas Edison. In general, automating some subset of those tasks doesn't make the other ones unnecessary. In fact, it makes them more important. It increases their economic value.